So, welcome back. It's been a while. We are Animation Dissection, the podcast that takes your favorite cartoons, cuts them open, and marvels at the blood and guts. So, I am your normal host here, R. Magnuson, also known as Neeksy, and I'm here with.
Zorak. Hey.
So, sorry for the protracted absence. It's been kind of a hectic time, but I'm hoping to get back in a schedule with this, and we're going to have more podcasts for you very shortly. Thank you very much for all the feedback. It's been really nice getting people suggesting series, and I'm definitely assembling a list of some of them, including what we're going to be doing for the next episode, which we'll announce at the end. But I'm excited to be back. Although things have changed for you, though, haven't they?
Yes, I am. I've come down and started thinking about it, and I realize I really just dislike anime now.
Well,
That might putting it a little,
well, that's a bit broad. I mean, there are still.
broad,
There's some things worth watching, but overall, yes, I don't think. I don't think it's as fun to kind of keep track of absolutely every single series that comes out because some of it is just not worth commenting on or having to assemble lists and study
after
all of
spending
it.
so many years just kind of staring at everything and just picking it out, I've realized that I actually don't want to know about everything anime is doing these days.
Yeah.
It turns out it's kind of depressing.
Yeah, I mean,
Kind of like,
there's a lot more content than ever, but that doesn't necessarily mean a lot of it's good or that the workers are treated all that well.
yeah, it's like there's still some good stuff there, but it's kind of like, I'm more than willing to look at and enjoy the good stuff, but I'm less willing to have to actually spend all the time at least figuring out what everything is in order to kind of deal with what I had to deal with, like with moderating type stuff. Now I can just ignore it and just actually only focus only on the good stuff and just pretend the other stuff doesn't exist.
Yeah, that's nice. Except, of course, considering some of the suggestions we've gotten, we're probably going to have to sit through some really terrible stuff because they will make some interesting discussions.
Well, that's different though.
Yeah, so well, we're electing to do that. So
The stuff I don't want to think about is the stuff that we probably not be legally allowed to discuss.
no, not at all.
If you know what I'm saying.
Yes. Well, we're going to say that without saying it. So,
Yeah.
anyway, so what you're here for, though, is a dissection of Ping Pong the Animation, which was a pretty good. I liked it a lot. A series from the spring 2014 Noitamina season. It only lasted 11 episodes, or as the Japanese and the French like to call a cour or a run. The manga that this is based off was originally by a artist named Taiyo Matsumoto. This series, at least this series, ran in some seinen magazines. So seinen being a manga genre for usually, I'd say, older teenagers and up. And it ran, I think, in the mid 90s, like 96, 97.
That's correct.
People who are familiar with certain animated films would be very familiar with this author. He's the one that wrote the comic for Tekkon King Crete, which had one of the guys that worked on the Animatrix things. I think Michael Arias is his name at Studio 4C. So he's had his work adapted before. He's kind of famous in Japan. His work gets a lot of awards. And I think this and Tekkon King Crete has kind of gotten his kind of very original style a lot more recognizable. You'll see his things in bookstores a lot more often now. So if you guys want to watch this, it is available on the Funimation service as well as on Hulu. So it's definitely highly suggested to check that out. The animation was produced at Tatsunoko Production. They're known more than just for the Capcom versus fighting game. They are a very long-running studio.
Who typically, I mean, they're quite prolific, but most people aren't huge fans of their actual production, in terms of what they're actually producing, because they produce a lot of kind of, I wouldn't say lower quality, but not supremely interesting works, and they do kind
Well,
of cut corners in some ways. I mean,
yeah, I mean, it's kind of just a production house for a lot of things that you do for kids and kind of a product selling anime in a lot of ways.
mm,
They kind of became well known for that stuff. So a lot of things that people have nostalgia for as children, not necessarily stuff that would stand the test of time. This is not Space Dandy or Cowboy Bebop level studio, but they were used as the production house for this production by famed Masaaki Yuasa.
who
Uh,
is the best?
Yes, well, he's a lot of fun. I really like his works. He has
No,
a
no,
very
stop. He is the best.
Other opinions are available, but I definitely think he's on the top of my list, at least of living directors.
He's the best.
Of living directors for me. I so Anyway, he currently has a studio called Science Saru that he has formed with Eun Young Choi. So I kind of feel that Tatsunoko was kind of like a temporary solution for him while he was kind of setting that up for this.
Hmm.
Because his new studio is all around using Flash. And those who know me or maybe have heard me talk about this in the past, I shit on Flash all the time. I'm normally not a fan of using it, although I have used it on productions before. It is entirely possible to use it well. It is just very rarely used well. I
It's
would,
used as a shortcut pretty frequently, and
yeah, and
for
it was a
making very cheap, much more cheap works that are typically don't look very good.
Yeah, I mean, yes, and the thing with Flash is it was originally never designed to be a production software. It was entirely web based, but as
Hmm.
HTML5 has really usurped using Flash for websites, they've had to kind of redesign that software. And there's kind of at least in America, there's a kind of an East Coast West Coast difference in its use. So the East Coast still uses Flash quite a bit. And I think a lot of independent animators like it because it's relatively cheap, whereas Toon Boom and the West Coast is really getting a huge amount of use, especially up in Canada now as well. But that software is extremely expensive. And then there's also TV Paint, which is kind of like a dark horse in animation. I feel it's used in Japan and Europe, and now it's starting to get some use in California. But because it's not raster and you can't reuse a lot of assets in the same way, it's really for the people who want that traditional look. And I think what really was surprising about this was that Yuasa was able to use Flash to make something look very traditional, very much like the manga in the kind of the varied inking style. There's a lot of line width variation, and that fits his mo in terms of style in a lot of ways. I mean, his previous works are things that certain people might be very familiar with. Things like Kemonozume, Cat Soup, uh, Kick Heart, Mind Game, Kaiba, Tatami Galaxy. He's worked on episodes of Crayon Shinchan. He did an episode of Space Dandy, and right now I think he's gotten a lot of attention for that episode of Adventure Time that a lot of people were talking about, the food chain. And he really likes playing with line and color, and his stuff is very kind of joyful, and he loves abstraction and letting the shapes really distort. I mean, he's kind of like I mean this in a positive way. He's kind of like a Japanese John Kricfalusi in certain ways. I think I like his work a lot better than John Kay, but John Kay, at least in the past, has written about a willingness to break character model for the sake of expression, and I think that has a valuable thing. I think it has to be used correctly, and I think Yuasa is one of the few people that are able to kind of break model for the expressiveness. And I think that's really a big part of his style. I mean, he cut his teeth at Crayon Shinchan, and that show definitely embraced this unusual art style. I mean, it's like it's kind of one of the most abstract styles that's
Well, it's
still
one
at
of
the
the
same.
few.
It's abstract yet representational at the same time. It's very odd.
It's what really one of the few animes that really have a very distinct and unique style that seems to depart from the kind of typical mainstream of what the generic anime style is. I mean, you see a lot of variation in the quote unquote generic, manga style of the large eyes that are really inspired by Disney, but Yuasa's got a very kind of he varies his style, but he's got a very distinct look to all of his works. You can actually kind of see him in every single one of his works, where you can look at it and say, "Oh, this clearly had Masaaki Yuasa doing, animation production or director work on it because this screams, his personal style."
Yeah, and I think, well, in film terms, they would call that an auteur, someone who, as a director or an artist, really has their identity tied up in all parts of the process. And I think that what makes him really unique is that they're in the animation production system, at least as we've been seeing it these days, being an auteur is much more difficult than it was before. I mean, making a film is something like I've always called it's like assembling a 100-piece puzzle. It's inherently a collaborative work because you have to work with different departments, and trying to do an entire film by yourself is extremely difficult. And you're lucky to get an 8-minute short done within a year or two if you're doing every single part of the process by yourself. and the thing is over time with CG being implemented into all this stuff and all the various like elements and the audience expectation, it's now like assembling a 1,000-piece puzzle, and so it's a lot harder to kind of as an artist have control over the entire visual elements and storytelling. So Yuasa, I think, is one of the few that has kind of been able to keep that kind of auteurship. I mean, I would say Satoshi Kon was very much an auteur in a lot of ways. I think
Right.
Otomo is an auteur, but I mean, unfortunately, Kon passed away a couple of years ago, and Otomo doesn't really get as many projects as we would like. And well, Steam Boy, but well, either way though, they that kind of auteurship has kind of slowly faded out, especially now that Ghibli has kind of halted a lot of its production, is not as active as it used to be, things like that. This is the stuff that kind of had that very specific style to it and a lot of creative control. So I think definitely he's kind of a big asset to the art form. Masaaki Yuasa is. So anyway, so enough, I guess, about the external outside of what's going on. We have a sports anime which is kind of very unique. I mean, so sports anime comes with a lot of, I would call it tropes, to borrow that word, that are
Baggage,
very
I would say.
baggage, or at least just a lot of cliches, and kind of like it's very kind of formulaic in a lot of ways. I mean, we have had a recent spate of sports anime that's become very popular, although I think they definitely still follow a lot of a lot of cliches and a lot of structure that is very similar. This
Well, I
one,
mean, there's kind of like three ways they kind of approach making sports anime. Either have very shonen type, aimed at a young male audience, where it's meant to be kind of it's not really any different from say like a fighting type, cartoon, where it's just basically it's an adventure that's built around the sport. You have the ones where it's very much aimed more likely at a female audience, where it's kind of a basically kind of
a harem of sorts without the female character as the center.
though sometimes it does have that as well.
Sometimes,
But
yes.
and that's actually where sports anime has been most popular as of late. And then you do also see, and this one kind of falls more in that type of group, where you do see the seinen type sports,
Mm.
manga or anime, where it's basically telling a quote unquote grittier or more real story about sports, something like say Slam Dunk or something, where
I
it's
would
very
say
much
this one, at least Ping Pong, is a bit closer to a Chihaya Furu for me,
sure.
because I think it's about the sport on some level, but it really focuses on the well, at least it feels like the sport is kind of like a way of conveying the characters' emotions, arcs, and changes.
Well,
You know,
I'd say that Chihara Furu falls into that last camp. I mean, though
yeah,
to be fair, Chihara Furu also has lots of the sort of it has shonen-y elements to it, more shoujo focus, but still it has aspects of that.
yeah. Well, it's one of those things that's hard. It's harder to define, and I think this one, I think Ping Pong is very special, not just visually, as we were talking about before of Yuasa's style, but also just in general the way it handles these types of themes of sportsmanship, of identity through sports and things like that. It's a bit harder to kind of define inside that genre, and I think that's what makes it very special.
Sure.
So let's go through kind of the overall characters and plot. I would say there's maybe about six characters, or something around that range, that are really kind of like the main core cast, and then you have a few more outside of that.
Sure.
We have the two main characters of this. There is Peko and Smile. I mean,
Yeah.
these are of course their nicknames for each other, but it's kind of what we know them as. Well, sometimes we hear their last names, Hoshino and Tsukimoto. For the sakes of symbols, we often see their names kind of translated as a visual kind of a shorthand, like so, like a star for Hoshimoto, or Tsukimoto being a moon, often as like representations of the characters. So they kind of use the kanji meetings additionally. So those two are really the main core, or at least, well, yeah, I guess so. I mean, it's kind of
I
hard
mean, the
because it
work's entirely
tracks.
built around the two. I mean,
Yeah,
it basically approaches a pretty wide cast, but those two are kind of the core focus of it, I would say.
yeah,
I mean, to really broadly talk about what they're kind of doing with the characters here, is that essentially ping pong is, I would say, to some degree, kind of the sports anime. It's about ping pong, but it's also not about ping pong at all. in the sense that, sure, it's about ping pong. It discusses ping pong, but you can go into this and it can be basically watched and kind of comprehended completely ambiguous to the actual sport that it's about. What's actually more
Mm.
important is the essence of sports, and it approaches this by using a cast that kind of embody the approach people take to sports or a competitive sports from a youth level and from a beyond that even once you're past that sort of point in life where you're actually capable of participating in a sport professionally.
Yeah.
So it's basically has a very diverse cast that kind of breaks down the various elements without making it too simplistic and too archetypical or anything.
Yeah, nothing shouts, he's a symbol of this.
Yeah.
It does it pretty subtly. And I would call it what it is. It's kind of almost a critique of sports as a business or as the sports world as it exists, and then the difference also between that and the sport as a game. And it kind of feels like it kind of divides a little bit between that, and that a lot of the characters, when they're kind of suffering the most, is when they're kind of obsessed with the numbers game that a lot of sports have turned into. In baseball, your RBI and all the that type of thing. Like you have to win this many games in order to stay in the professional world, and it becomes entirely about wins and losses. Whereas the characters really find their salvation in this by kind of embracing losing, or embracing the joy of playing the game and finding that being more important. It's kind of like, being an artist for the sake of yourself, or being someone who's trying to, navigate something that has turned the art form into an industry.
Well, I don't know if that's necessarily a business so much if it's that because sure there is that element to it, but it's in general competitiveness I think more than the
Mm-hmm.
actual necessarily like, oh, they're making money out of it. They've made it a capitalist type thing, because a lot of it's also just the essence of focusing on a sport entirely from the standpoint of I gotta win. My personal self worth and value is based around winning and being the best at this. The ego, the kind of the eccentric kind of thing of I want to be on top of the sport. I want to compete. I want to be the champion of something. And as you say, the other side of it is the fact that, like, say, ping pong, yeah, there's a sport and there's a lot of intention and science and research and and people working really hard to be good at ping pong. But at its core, it's still it's a game. It's something that people do for fun, even completely ambiguous to the fact that there is this competitive element. There's
Well, that
people
there's
who
this
are ping pong
world that
champions.
exists around this sport.
Right.
Like again, so there's the sport world, and then there is people using it as a pastime or as a game, or for some other reason, then to kind of rise up in kind of a ranked order. Like there's kind of these separate aspects of it, and a lot of sports anime, I think, again, this is almost like a critique on those, where it is those anime are very much about, like, we got to be the best, so we got to keep training harder, 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 and coming up with more ridiculous things as a way of just kind of fitting into that world of rising up and rivals and things like that. Whereas this one is kind of like, well, that exists, and there are people who thrive within that, but at the same time, it can also be an entirely damaging experience. I mean, we have, so I'd say so the characters we have, Peko and Smile. Peko being uh, this young boy who's very spirited, very energetic, kind of a little bit, at least at the start, he's very full of himself. I mean, kind of he kind of takes pride in the fact that he has talent without having practiced all that much. I mean, he
Yeah,
even
he
denigrates the
doesn't put
idea
the
of
work in
practice
at
at
all.
first. He doesn't want to, and the thing is he keeps winning. So it's kind of like, I remember there's this phrase, the worst two words in the English language is good job. I mean, I don't agree with it, but the idea is that if someone is kind of complimented over and over and over again and has never really been challenged by anything or never loses, they never progress. And Pecco's problem is he hasn't really been challenged. And we see when he finally loses, I think then in the first, was it in the first episode or second episode?
I believe it's like the second.
When he plays the Chinese player, and he gets just wrecked, by this previously professional player, and he has a conniption. I mean, he becomes like he becomes like a child. I mean, he's young, he's in high school, but I mean, he breaks down as if he's like an 8-year-old having a petulant fit. And he kind of just breaks down entirely. And we also find out that Smile, who's kind of like his opposite yet equal at the same time. He's much more kind of
It's
straight
extremely
faced.
quiet and
He's extremely,
reserved.
yeah, very straight faced with a lot of things. I mean, he still has kind of he has a biting tongue, but he hides it under this kind of monotone. And he has also a certain level of gift, but he's actually been playing easy on Peko the entire time. They make a differentiation as like, oh, when Peko's not around, Smile is really, really good, but somehow whenever he plays Peko, his playing style changes and he kind of lets him go. And I think that was kind of Smile's way for a long time of coddling him. And I think what Smile's arc is, at least for I'd say maybe about 75% of it, is going, well, am I actually helping him or am I hurting him by doing this?
Well,
By
I think
holding
that's
himself back.
there's that part of it. But there's also the aspect that Smile essentially is completely ambitionless, completely in life. He's got no real desire except for to essentially coast through life. Not in the sense that Peko coasts through life. Peko is carefree. Smile just basically wants to diminish himself in life and kind of just have a very
Well,
it's hard to get really an
it's the
impression when
robot
he's
thing. He will do, when someone asks him to do something, he'll most often do it.
just because
He'll
it's
do.
easy and he doesn't want to have a fuss or trouble.
Yes, it is easier just to follow the orders. I mean, there are a few times of defiance. I mean, like when people ask him when he wants to coach kids, and he's like, "I hate kids. They're too unpredictable," and things like that. But it's hard. I mean, I think one of the things. I mean, there's a lot of debate I think people have about some of Smile's motivations when he starts becoming very serious about ping pong under the tutelage of his teacher Koizumi or Butterfly Joe. Well,
Well,
they all have
Joe.
nicknames.
Yeah.
The but the thing is like some say it's like, well, he kind of he loses himself in becoming ambitious and in training to be the best. And my reading of it, at least when I was looking at kind of like the overall theme of it, is that Smile was doing it all to kind of save Peko from his own complacency, to become the best, to beat him, to kind of do this kind of very tough love, I think, in a lot of ways. And at the same time, he wants, he becomes this machine, this ping pong machine, fitting in with this kind of stereotype and the leitmotif that they have throughout this of that he's a robot. Or I think one of the running gags is that people keep calling him a Roomba, and you see like little Roombas like in various situations whenever they bring him up. Um, and I think it's his way is he wants to save Peko, but at the same time he needs Peko to save him. They both kind of need to rescue each other from some kind of rut that they found themselves in.
Yeah, I mean,
I
because
mean, the idea of a hero, this is a very big, definitely a very big thing throughout this entire series is the concept of a hero and what that means to various different people.
yeah, and a big thing with Smile is that he plays ping pong. He kind of resents the fact that people approach ping pong as a sport. Actually, he
Mm-hmm.
only plays ping pong mostly because it's, as he says, it's a thing to do. I mean, he secretly. We basically learned this more towards the end that he loves playing ping pong with his friend Peko, but he doesn't really see the point to the competitiveness of it. He ends up getting pulled into it in the sense that he's extremely talented, but he's got his lack of ambition is really centered on the fact that he doesn't really see the value in trying to focus on something that's supposed to be for fun and make it into this super competitive thing. To say ruin people's careers by beating them in something that he's good at, but he's got really no desire in being ruthless about.
Yeah. And again, I think that's where his conflict comes in is he actually being kind by holding back, or is it better to kind of cut someone off when they aren't going to make it rather than kind of string them along? And I think that's a conflict that he finds himself not just with Peko, but also with Wenge and all the other characters, I think, over time. Again, like he feels like beating them is a form of rescuing them. And in some ways it kind of is. Whereas with Peko, he kind of rescues them not by necessarily destroying them, but by bringing the fun of the game to them. I mean,
Well,
the
that
music
really comes
differences as
only
well.
at the
Near the
very end, though.
end.
Peko doesn't beat like anybody the entire thing other than like scrubs.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
it's basically, though, I mean, those are the two main, and that's kind of their kind of dynamic. And then we have, I'd say that the next person we really meet that they focus on heavily, and probably actually my favorite character, I think, in the entire thing is Kong Wenge, who they
Yes.
nicknamed China because he's a transfer student from China that was kicked off the national team for the youth national team, and he came to Japan to basically prove himself in the backwaters, so to speak, and then return to the country and be able to get back on the national team. And he's super confident that he's better than everyone in Japan, and he soon finds that really that's not the case.
Yeah, I mean, and one thing I actually really appreciate is that they actually had a Chinese actor,
Oh,
and
so
they have
good
him
that they did
speaking
that.
in Chinese, and they subtitle it. They're not afraid of having some kind. They like, whenever you see like a foreigner in most anime, they'll have just a Japanese person try to do, and it's the worst English or the worst in most of the other languages. Whereas US is like, now we're going to bring in an actual Chinese person. He's going to speak in actual Chinese, and we'll just subtitle it. I mean, well, of course, the character will sometimes speak in English because, of course, he's a transfer student. Essentially, he's kind of brought in as a ringer, but also he's supposed to be a way of revitalizing this kind of dying school program in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and,
So
and to be clear, he's like on a separate club from all the other characters. He's on his kind of his own thing.
yes, yes, there's kind of like
Yeah,
three schools that we really see
yeah,
throughout this entire thing.
yeah. And with Wenge, like a big focus is entirely his obsession for getting home because really with his background is that his mother basically hasn't seen like his family in ages in the sense that he was basically taken away from his family to be in the ping pong program because he showed talent, and he basically feels like he's failing like all those people who've sacrificed stuff to get him where he is by
Yeah,
not actually being on the top where he thinks he belongs. And with him, it's really coming to terms with the fact of where he is and what he can do in life, and that turns out your life isn't over just because you're not good at a sport, that you spend your youth at. You can fail at things in your youth and still manage to live a good life.
yeah, or like being kicked off the main team doesn't necessarily mean that you have absolutely no value. It's just that you can find your value somewhere else, even within the same field.
Yep.
And I think there's also the big financial pressure too, and also it's a cultural issue where you have China's achievement ethos. When you see like a lot of the way they do their Olympics programs and things like that, there's kind of a different approach to it. I mean, he often he looks down upon, when he, at least initially when he's in Japan, about oh, look at the way Japan does ping pong and things like that. They don't they're he looks down upon it as this kind of a kiddie pool with people who aren't really that serious about it.
And
He
especially because China,
underestimates to his
I
peril.
mean, China is like the kind of the core of ping pong as a sport.
Hmm.
They have in real life pretty much to some degree dominated it for ages.
Well, and that's why I think a lot of the characters initially are like, "Oh man, I really want to play him," or "Oh, he is the kind of the first, the top guy that everyone wants to beat." At least
I mean,
initially,
he is
as introduced in the series. I mean,
and
yes,
he
he's
is
talented.
extremely talented in the series. It's just that there's some other people in here that turns out are basically monsters. And
Yeah,
monster number one would easily be it's a Ryuichi Kazama,
yeah,
who's
yeah.
nicknamed Dragon. He's basically the team captain and leader of the
Kaio, the school that has kind of really adopted the Chinese system of we're gonna do ping pong, but we're gonna do it like it's a freaking um it's like a camp. I mean, it's one of those things where like the players have nutritionists, they have all these really strange robotics, ping pong arms, and they have treadmills that they have to run on while playing ping pong against these robotic arms. They have like CAT scan machines to view like their muscle tissue. I mean, like
it's the scientific
it's
method
silly.
basically.
It's
They,
well,
they are it's a
it's
school that's obsessed with trying to produce ping pong champions and
oh yes,
and Dragon essentially he is the ultimate in the sense that he is incredibly focused only on being good at ping pong and he has incredible talent but also he's just constantly focusing on improving and it turns out as the series goes on basically is that he's actually basically covering up some deep own personal insecurities that are driving the fact that really he is excellent at ping pong but there's no joy to it.
no. Well, I think the joy was taken out of it. I mean, considering, I mean, he exists not just as a person who is very good at the sport. He has to act as a symbol, not just for the school, but for I think his grandparents' company. I mean, he has a lot of pressure put onto him that kind of doesn't allow him to embrace losing and things like that. I mean, he has a lot of external pressure in addition to the internal pressure that already exists for anybody who plays an organized sport.
And to be fair, some that those external pressures are ones that he's kind of mentally built up upon himself to
Oh
some
yes,
degree.
I mean
Because I mean, his
he
own
wants to
family's
meet.
kind of around him, like turn it down a little bit. But he feels that he has to be the ultimate, this undefeatable force. He is,
He has a guilt complex, and I think in a lot of ways that he feels a certain level of guilt and obligation that is not necessarily being held over him at all times, but he thinks it is.
yeah,
And so
and
he has to
basically,
live up to those expectations. And there's that leitmotif throughout the entire series is whenever before a match there's shots of him just in a bathroom stall as the toilet flushes, essentially I think implying that he's throwing up before these matches because there's just that anxiety and stress. I mean, there's, as you said earlier, for him he's kind of like he's the opposite of Pecco in that there is no joy in it for him anymore, or whatever. There was joy, but it has been just scienced out of him in a lot of ways. I mean, with the training regimens they show, it's intense, and it almost becomes a little bit silly and sci-fi in a lot of ways. And I think Yuasa kind of embraced a little bit of that by making it. Again, this was originally made in the '90s, so he definitely updates a lot of the technology and the communications and things like that.
I mean, he's extreme even for the rest of like say of his school. Kaio, like
Well, where they shave all the students' heads and they have
yeah,
the
well, yeah, but I mean, the school goes out of it in part because the founder of the school and the director of the school is a ping pong champion, and as we learn, he's related to or he's got connections with the other sort of ping pong coaches throughout the series that other people interact with, and
and then
he
also Poseidon, the company
yeah, he
that
owns a
makes all
company that
the
sells ping pong gear and ping pong
shoes
clothing and
and
whatnot.
yeah, like it's a sports outfit essentially.
Yeah, and I mean he's part of that family himself, But the school itself, like the school's focused on it, but even like the school's own actual coach basically comments that who is actually Dragon's uncle comments the fact that he wishes that Dragon would actually realize that the team, why maybe not the best team that the school's ever had, they're great people, and he loves the coach loves the team, and he just wishes that Dragon would realize that, hey, winning is great, but it's still, it's ping pong still. It's a sport.
He
It's not a
wants the
war,
team and the players to recognize their own value,
right?
and that's where I think one of the big
And in the value
struggles.
beyond just winning at ping pong.
Yeah, well, finding value from within rather than from the external places where you get
Right.
complimented for wins or denigrated for losses. Finding value, going, hey, I had fun or I enjoy this, and I think I'm doing well. It's coming from within rather than external.
And
And I think
one,
there's a
one
lot of external pressures though put on the school and all these characters, but I think at the same time it's acknowledging those external pressures but realizing that it's much more important to have that from within rather than from external.
one of the other big focuses in the series, and mentioning this, transitioning on to like I'd say one of the next major characters, is the fact that there's hard work is an important part of being good at a sport. You have to practice, you have to train, but there is something to be said for like intrinsic talent, and it's the balance between talent and hard work that really drives everything.
I think I know who
And
you're talking about.
and one of the characters that basically, as we learn, has essentially no real aptitude, but is extremely hardworking in training and
Well, I mean,
studying.
he's also practically physically disabled in a sport that definitely there's consequences for that.
Yeah, and that's one of another childhood friend of Pecco and Smile, Sakuma, whose nickname is Demon, an anagram of its name, and
Yes.
basically he's got I forget what was his ocular condition he's got.
He's extremely nearsighted. Like he
Yeah,
can't. I mean, he also doesn't have that. It's a kind of a skill where you can really see the trace movements pretty easily. He doesn't have that either, but he has his glasses are extremely thick and he's pretty much blind without them,
yeah.
but that also limits the field of vision to the frames of the glasses, and and his eye condition is so bad that I mean there's no way you can make contacts that thick.
So basically, he's in ping pong. He's really has been working all his life to be good at it after seeing how good Pekka was during his childhood. But he really lacks any natural talent whatsoever. He works hard. The thing is, and the big thing the series says that hard work can get you really far, but it's not going to take you to the top. the whole ethos of like hard work can get you anywhere doesn't mean anything if you just completely lack, the core talent. Some people
There's a
are
brick
simply
wall,
geniuses.
essentially, an
Right.
impassable wall, and it's like, and again, like the series says, like, just because that wall exists and that you're never going to be able to get over that wall one way or the other, again, it's that you still have value.
Yeah, you still have
It's
value, and you can still enjoy a sport even if you can't pass that wall.
yes, exactly. I mean, I think the series is very positive in that ways overall, without being kind of stupidly optimistic that a lot of sports anime is like, oh, if you just work hard, you'll be able to do these physically impossible things. And I think the show kind of embraces an odd realism. And even though the style is very odd and abstract, it's probably one of the more realistic series out there in the way it treats just the physical realities of doing things.
Well, that's kind of Yuasa's sort of style, and what the works he tends to gravitate towards in general is that he tends to do works that are very grounded in terms of their core emotional message. That they have a very central kind of thing, that it's not an astounding thing like you can do anything. It's kind of, it has a very core central sort of thing. We saw this very much with Tatami Galaxy, but it's very grounded and realistic. The style around it is very outlandish, and sometimes the actual narrative elements are very crazy. Like that couldn't happen, or well, that makes no sense. But it's still very extremely completely grounded. But the message is ultimately optimistic in a very realistic way.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes it really just an overall, again, it's a nice change of pace from a lot of the stuff we see. Fighting shonen spirit and the spiral and all that stuff doesn't really translate into kind of real life lessons or morality or anything like that. So it's kind of nice to see someone out there willing to kind of tackle these types of emotional and almost philosophical issues, while both having a sense of joy visually and not being too strict with the visual reality that's being presented, but at the same time treating these like real people and real characters with desires and goals that are understandable. So let's see. You're talking about with Sakuma. I think with his arc, he actually does. I think he does beat Peko at one point.
Yeah,
He
he
where
crushes Peko, and they basically, that's basically the match that completely sends Peko off on his extreme downward spiral, where
yeah,
basically he completely abandons the sport. He goes and basically skips out on school. He just basically eats and goes on dates and
he
basically just
grows out his hair. And one thing we forgot to mention, Peko has this great trait, and I think throughout it's one of the funnier things is that he's like this candy addict, or at
yep.
least this encyclopedic knowledge of junk food, down to the point where he analyzes the company's outputs
He
as
criticizes the consumers at some point, like, why do people like this shitty candy? This candy sucks.
or like, people underestimate the value of the, like the caramel version versus the nut version. It's like, this is common sense. Or like, oh, like the gari gari popsicle. I mean, he analyzes it if he's a market analyst. It's kind of funny.
It's funny, and it's also extremely funny how nobody around him cares. They're just kind of just ignoring him, like that's nice,
Well, they
Peko.
call him like candy addict or like candy otaku all the time, and
Yeah,
it's just like,
and when he
again,
comes
there's some.
back, basically everybody keeps on joking about how he's got gained weight.
Oh yeah. And well, like again, like the entire thing is just filled with leitmotifs. I mean, like you got China. China has his thing with the airplane as the symbol for returning home, and the ball, or his strokes, or the symbol they use during these kind of expressionistic battle scenes, is an airplane. And then you have dragon, of course, is a dragon, and things like that. And you have, I think, both a moon shape and a robot for smile and things like that.
With
Like the
Dragon, well, the Dragon's got the main thing is the Dragon is how people perceive him is the Dragon, but his
yeah.
real relate to me are there's basically the two of the flowers, because his
Mm.
because his father was a florist, and basically the big thing of his guilt is that his father was a failed florist and basically ended up die. It's not made clear if he dies or if he commits suicide.
Or just runs away, in shame and leaves him
Well,
with the rest of the
basically
family or
the
something
thing
like
with
that.
them climbing the thing, and then it's like, father, watch out, and he looks like he falls off a cliff.
Yeah, like either way, there's kind of a
But basically, his father's business failed, and his grandfather, who runs the ping pong business, ultimately bailed him out, and was really down. It's actually really sad if it's the grandfather himself who's extremely down on his side of the family for its other family members. They don't really go too much into the grandfather's own sort of opinions there.
Well, I mean, he does also he exists as kind of a figure for there's I'd say there's also the main cast, then you have the adult old people cast.
Yeah.
You know,
Of
he's
like
a figure in that.
old former ping pong, players who turned out to be really good in their youth and used to be interrelated in ways that are pretty similar to the core cast today.
Yeah, they kind of exist as a mirror of juxtaposition. I mean, right down to situational similarity. So
It's not exact by any
no,
means in the
I mean,
sense
well,
that the
it's as for juxtaposition, as in
yeah,
there is a difference, but situationally it becomes very similar, where you have an injured player and someone else who can either throw the game and help this person not have their career get ruined, or you know just play as hard as you can and let it go. And the older cast did the former option, whereas we see what happens when someone is kind of more honest in the way they play, which is what turns out in this case with the younger cast. And of course, having the older cast being the coaches and the ones kind of pushing them towards this ultimate climax is very interesting. It's kind of like a new game plus thing. They're we're going to try to correct the horrible mistake we ended up making.
well, I mean, I don't think it's quite as overt in that sense. In that, the
Well, I
only
don't think
person who
that's
really
yeah.
pushes for that is, I'd say, is Tsukimoto or Smile's coach, Joe, in the
Yeah.
sense that he's basically pushing Smile to basically see what it's like, because Smile has got no drive whatsoever, and he basically says, "Look, we have a lot of relations." He basically actually says like, "Look, I realize I'm pushing you against the school that who is founded by the person who I end up let win and become a champion. Basically, my career ended." Basically, he was a guy who had a crippled knee, and he basically went easy on him because he was a friend, and he didn't want to ruin his career by focusing on his knee and potentially causing him to ruin his knee altogether.
Yeah.
And he basically says it's not a vendetta why I'm doing this. I just wanted to show you what the peak of the sport is, what it's like to be at the top and see, the things that you can only see if you actually go into this and try to win.
Well, he wants to see him with passion, essentially.
Right.
Which I think on some level there's a positive side to it, but there's also you know there's kind of a dark side to being impassioned.
Sure. I mean, that seems to be partially what's consuming Dragon. Like, Dragon's got the passion to win, but he doesn't actually have any passion for the sport itself.
Yeah, exactly. Well, again,
Eh,
like all that passion is coming at him as external pressure, or at
yeah,
least as he
sure.
interprets as external pressure,
Yeah. I mean, the other coach, or elderly person pushing this is, we don't actually know what her name is. She's merely called Obaba,
or
or,
like
old
old
lady.
woman. Yeah, I mean, she runs
She
the
runs the table tennis dojo where Smile and Pecco and Demon learn to play as children, and basically she basically teaches young children and younger adults and some older adults basically how to do ping pong, and she comes across as super jaded and not really giving a shit,
yeah.
but secretly she just does, and just she's just a
Well, like
grumpy old
again, well,
lady.
she again, as I think the coaches match the players' themes in a lot of ways. So again, I think she is about teaching kids and the joy of it. She knows how to train things competitively. I mean, she was a figure in that competitive world, but she doesn't really care about kind of maintaining one's status within that world.
Yeah, she doesn't care if any of the people under her necessarily become the top of their sport,
She'll
unless they
help them
really
if they
want
want
to.
to.
She'll
Yeah,
support them. It's just that she's basically kind of like, hey, if you just want to come in here and just half-ass your way, like you know don't disrespect the sport, but if you're not looking at the top, it's perfectly fine.
yeah.
You know, Smile makes a comment at the very end of the series, like basically the last sentence in like the series is that he doesn't dislike mediocre players, in the sense that there's nothing wrong with being mediocre at a
Or at
sport,
least unnoticed. I think, because I think he uses the phrase unnoticed or someone who doesn't stand out. Essentially, like
I
they
thought
might
it said
still be good.
mediocre.
It just something like that. But around that theme of someone who
Yeah, I mean,
just
basically, it's
plays
like
and
there's
they
nothing
do what they
wrong with
can.
being just someone who enjoys it.
Yeah.
And she's the big one, and then of course there's Dragon's grandfather is the other one, basically where he was the one who was basically he became on top and was champion for playing while injured, but at the same time Joe, Smiles' coach, basically let him win, and that kind of drove them, where Joe's just a elderly coach of a basically a nothing school, and now Dragon's grandfather basically runs an entire corporation built around ping pong, an industry.
Well, I mean, and we see ads all the time, Poseidon as a brand that we see just constantly throughout this entire thing. I mean, they even make jokes about him being just like this ultimate salesperson as well, even when there's that final reconciliation at the end.
Yeah, where basically it's like, I've got a ping pong paddle that's great for old people, and it's kind of like, yeah, you just, oh, you.
Yeah, I mean, and again, it's nice to see kind of like a positive ending. You know, a lot of stuff that tries to have depth sometimes has this kind of, well, we have to make sure everything either ends sad or ambiguous for it to have depth. And I go, well, no, something can be very, can be very meaningful without necessarily being somber, which was kind of
And
a
it's not
nice change of
optimistic,
pace.
and neither is it optimistic in the sense of being like, oh, everything's perfect, everything's
Oh
great.
yeah, again, well, it handles
Everybody's
it
just finding
realistic.
their own happiness, and that's kind of Yuasa's kind of signature thing, is that he's really into finding your own happiness as you can.
Yeah,
I
it's
mean, he
success
doesn't
that's
write
not.
these works, but he's very much gravitates to that kind of work.
Yeah, thematically, I think he kind of he has a kind of a positivity, but without being saccharine. It's positivity with depth is kind of like a way I would call it. And as you mentioned, I think one of my favorite characters is Koizumi, or Butterfly Joe. Just some of his quirks and his mannerisms, I think, are just really interesting and funny.
His
Um,
constant speaking in English.
oh, the random English, but also like the way he treats his classroom, where they're literally taking the test and he is trying to get Smile to take the practice seriously, and all the other students are like, hey, could you stop talking to him? We're trying to take a test here." Like
Or basic
and
in the way he always kind of builds, he kind of phrases it around like he's trying to get Smile to go out with him.
oh yeah, like he leaves the training regimen in his shoe locker, like what a 16-year-old girl would do with like a love note. And he even uses the phrase like, "Oh, springtime has come for me." It's like he's kind of playing with that kind of visual, or at least metaphor and thing like that. And he's just a lot more fun. I mean, he's one of my favorite characters in this.
Baba ends up doing that later too with Peko,
Oh, with the well, like, I love
where
you.
it's like, treat me like one of your honeys, and it's like, oh God, no, please stop. And well, that's kind of a thing that Peko ends up actually taking up as his own thing actually into the series, basically towards the end, where it's like she's like, I love you, Peko, and then basically Peko ends up taking that entire thing like, wait a minute, yeah, I just love
It's
everybody
like,
in
oh,
this
I
sport.
love you, Dragon. He does that. I mean, again,
Yeah,
well,
he does that. He does that also at the
Smile
very final scene too.
Well, Smile picks up Koizumi's random English when they show him being an instructor as well, where he's like, "Oh, everybody, lesson."
Yeah.
So that was kind of interesting. But he's just one of my favorite characters, just because like they give him a decent amount of quirks where he really stands out, and his motivations are very complex. I feel like you can't really get a read on him
Mhm.
entirely, because he's not a black and white character motivation wise.
Well, I think that's very much true of the entire cast. I
Well,
mean,
true, but
it's
it's just,
a very interesting. All the characters have very interesting elements to them, in a variety of ways, and where they because
well, some of them explicitly stated a bit easier. Like I think with Peko and I think Dragon. I mean, they often kind of state their goals very plainly.
I don't
In
know.
certain,
Dragon
not
lies all the
well,
time,
yeah,
though.
but I mean,
That's
but
like that's the thing, is like Dragon is constantly lying. Like
well,
it's
to
actually one of
himself, yeah.
well, lying to them himself and also to other people. Like there's that thing that comes up where Sakuma visits him when he's in the restroom doing his quiet thing. After Sakuma ended up quitting the sport due to being destroyed and realizing I have no talent for this.
Yeah.
Is that basically he has Dragon, why Dragon plays, like for who Dragon plays, and Dragon says for himself. And then and then he's like, you're lying. And then he's asked the same thing by his junior
Cousin.
captain immediately
Oh,
after.
right.
He says, oh, I play for the team. And he's basically just lying for everyone because he doesn't actually seem to know who he's playing for.
Well, he
He's
wants
just playing.
approval on some level.
He wants approval, and he feels like he has to be on top. He has to be a champion. He has to win, because to not be on winner, to show weakness, is to lose. That's something that's basically been railroaded into him, is that any sort of defeat, any sort of of weakness is in itself, that it itself is defeat. That means you're a non-person. You're not even human.
Yeah. Well, again, I think it's just that it's a lot easier to kind of figure out the motivation with those characters in the end. Like I still kind of figure out whether or not with Koizumi, whether or not some of his stuff with Smile is for himself or for Smile purely. Again, I think it's because he doesn't go 100% one way or the other. There's an
I mean, I
element
think
of
it's a
it
mixture
that's
of both.
yeah, and I think that's what makes it interesting. Is like in a lot of literature and a lot of stuff that's very we have only 11 episodes to kind of tell this story. it becomes kind of a tool, or at least kind of sometimes a cop out of defining characters as fully good or fully evil, or their motivations being all in one direction without that kind of internal conflict, because that might end up confusing from whatever the main conflict would be. And this one feels like such a great ensemble piece that they're able to let some of the stuff exist in the gray area and never truly get defined, but it doesn't detract from the clarity of the theme.
Yeah, I mean it's focused very much on Peko and Smile, but like you say, it is super in an ensemble work in that it really focuses on the differences between these characters, from their backgrounds and what they're doing on their days. Like one of the interesting things I found is episodes was the one that this work, just real quick, derail myself. It's that sense that this work is incredibly tight and that there's very little wasted in it, which I very much am for. That it doesn't waste any time. Like it uses its entire volume of 11 episodes, which is not it's just not a lot of episodes, and it uses all the runtime in those episodes extremely well. Little bits of repeat filler at the beginning of some of the episodes aside.
Well, I will say that in that first episode where the two are just listening to the sounds of the ping pong, there's like, I would say it felt like 15 seconds of just white sky as we just hear that. Like, there
But
was a
it
little
works.
bit. Oh, it works. I mean, but well, I would say it's not time wasted, but it's willing to let there be kind of like a languid pacing when it feels like it needs to.
Yeah,
So
sure.
it's quickly paced. I mean, narratively, without necessarily having to be quick action wise.
Sure. And where I was going with this is that there's an episode towards the middle where it's focusing on all the different characters, like I think it was New Year's Eve, where it's
Something
basically
like that, or Christmas, or something like
yeah,
that.
or Christmas basically, where it's like where is every one of the major characters essentially on Christmas, like how their Christmases are turning out, and Peko at this point had fallen off the ping pong wagon. It's basically he's out with a girlfriend, but he's even treating her like essentially like shit, and he ultimately gets drunk and just runs around drunkenly screaming at people like an
Oh, and then
asshole.
is that when he throws his paddle into the
That is.
river? Yeah, yeah.
He throws out his childhood paddle and Smiles basically just at home, just staring at a Christmas cake that Joe got him, and basically he's extremely alone because his family just isn't there at all.
Yeah, I don't think we ever see any of
Well,
his family members.
no, they specifically say that his mother comes home like in the morning and
Mm,
leaves in the afternoon when he basically comes from work, and his father's like dead.
something like that, yeah.
Yeah. And then they show with Dragon, they basically Dragon's cousins like got a thing for him, and basically she tries inviting him out, but then she just basically he never shows up, and it's kind of like her kind of like, oh, I really wish he would be there. And he comes home and sees that she'd been texting him, but his phone is there. He's not at his phone. He's basically just working out still, in the gym in his home, just working
At
super
like
hard.
at midnight.
Yeah, and then with China, China's the one who has the most interesting arc, I say, in the sense that
Mm,
he goes from being so focused on like, oh, I gotta win,
himself,
get
yeah.
back in, I gotta get back to China, and then he's like realizes that he's not gonna be able to make it back on the national team in China. That dream is dead, and but he basically goes like, well, I was hired to stay here, and help the school's team improve, and it's like, and basically his assistant, guy that came over from China is like, look, your life isn't over because you haven't achieved here, your life is only just beginning. You're still like 17, and his
Yeah.
entire thing is that also his guilt towards his mother is that his mother actually visits him in Japan, and he has basically a great time with his team, where his team isn't great at ping pong, but they're good people, and he basically just opens up to them and has a great New Year's Eve. He's the one who has basically the best New Year's or Christmas or whatever it was, in the
Whatever it
sense that
is,
he's
yeah.
basically having fun with his family and his friends. He's embracing his life, and really kind of that's really the point that he comes to terms with where he is. That's kind of I would say almost to some degree like the completion of his arc, because he ends up losing to Peko in the final kind of tournament that they have there, but it's not he's pretty much fine with that. At that point he's realized like, oh, you're better than me. Hey, have fun facing Dragon. He basically accepts his defeat. He's not
Well, and then
he's
he
not
goes off and
broken
says
over.
like, "Oh, well, I have a team to help as
Yeah.
well." Like they show him going like, I'm going to take this side of what I was supposed to do here seriously. Whereas first it's like, well, I'm nominally here to help this team, but I'm really here out to try to return.
Yeah.
He
I mean,
finally.
He
Yeah.
basically said, like they might not be good at singles, but he was like, I'm pretty confident of how well they'll do at teams. They're not going to win it, but they'll do pretty good. Like he's fine. He realizes that he's fine with people just doing the best to their ability, and it actually turns out, basically, we learn in the end that he actually turns out he works hard enough that he actually managed to get, he doesn't get back into the national team for China, but he actually ends up becoming onto like the Olympic team for Japan, which is pretty impressive.
Yeah. Well, again, it's he finds the
Especially because
value in things around him rather than seeking after something that's illusory and impossible.
yeah, and especially because he actually, it turns out he ends up basically pushing out and beating people that were beating him on the high school level just because he manages to apply himself. We never see why or how that happens, but you can look at it and reasonably see like, oh, he's got a much more realistic view. He's got a much more grounded view now of his life, and he does things with that.
Yeah. Oh, you know what I said earlier that I think Koizumi is the best character? No, I realized I forgot. The best character is Gloomy Guy.
Oh yeah,
Yeah, he ends up being the best.
he,
He's the best
he's
character.
beaten.
He's beaten
He's
by Tsukimoto Smile at first. I think pretty early on,
I
and
think it's
he's
like the third episode or something.
yeah, and then he goes like, you know what, I kept on trying hard at this in my own gloomy way, but you know what, I think maybe I'll just go out to the sea. And then they show him later at the ocean with just
Selling food.
yeah, selling like the summer foods and things like that. And he's like, oh, you know what, maybe I should go to the mountains. He keeps on thinking that happiness will be somewhere else, and then at the very end he goes like, oh man, you know what, Ping Pong, I really loved you. I'm so sorry, please take me back.
Yeah, he ends up like flying back to Japan after wandering the world,
Yeah,
which is a very like I have no idea if this is originally in the manga or
no,
not,
it's not. I
but
think he was just created for this.
it is such a Yuasa type thing. Like it reminds me of of the stuff, and like obviously Tatami Galaxy wasn't also like a Yuasa original, but like
It's an
it
adaptation,
reminds me
yeah.
of so much shit from like Tatami Galaxy that's like it's goofy as hell and it doesn't make a lot of sense, and that it's like that seems highly implausible, but it really fits like the ethos of what they're doing here because he comes back to Japan, sees the tournament that he basically caused him to quit, a year ago. It's happening now
And
again
not
for
just
this
quit
year.
that, but he seemed to just quit life altogether.
Yeah, he comes back to the tournament and he realizes that, well, I'm not good at ping pong. I'm not great at this, but I love this sport. You can love a sport without being, extremely talented at it or even participating in it. You can just love a sport. It's like lots of people love football, and love football in their youth playing it, but they're not going to be a football champion. They can enjoy football for the love of the sport, of everything
Yeah.
in it.
Well, it's like
And
being the nominal best is not the apex of existence.
yeah, and basically the funny thing with him is that they ultimately show him then at the the Olympics in the very end, in the audience
Oh
cheering on.
yeah, I remember that now. I thought your favorite character was going to be the kite that keeps stealing people's food.
I do like that kite. Basically with the setting that they keep on showing little visual things of kites stealing food from people. And I like
And
that.
for those unfamiliar, a kite is a type of I think a falcon or something like that.
It's like a hawk, yeah.
It's a hawk, that's right. And they have like a warning in the background, and this whole thing takes place in Enoshima, which is kind of like this, kind of like an island around area where it's kind of famous. You'll see it in other animes and referenced in a lot of places, but they kind of have that as the setting. So of course you have these, just like in California, you have like seagulls just stealing people's food. They just, for some reason, that just happens to everybody in the series constantly. Even at the very end, it happens again.
Yeah, at the very end, and it's just kind of like, oh,
Well, it steals dragons.
you forgot
it steals
about it,
Dragon's
but that
burger.
that
It's
plot
like, God
element
damn it.
didn't go away.
Well, it's not a plot element. I think it's just
I
like
always true.
I think it's just
Well,
a
setting
comedic
element like
leitmotif.
didn't go
Yeah.
away. It was funny because like they brought it up early on, and it happened like twice early on, never happened again, and then all of a sudden out of nowhere, it's like bam.
The comedic timing on all that stuff is just great. And again,
Well,
like this whole
that's
thing is not really like it's not really a comedy, but it knows
got-
how to
it's got
balance.
some
It knows how to
elements
put
to
the
it.
comedic elements in there just perfectly. And I think we should also go, I think, into the visuals now too, where the way it handled it felt like he kind of wanted to harken back to the manga in a lot of ways, where he kind of does this really interesting screen paneling,
Yep.
or he does a lot of different elements going on at the same time, where so you'll have like the kind of the main scene of what the reaction is going, and you'll have he sometimes does like these little comment chat windows from the audience kind of superimposed in the corner, or he'll suddenly kind of cut in like a small little box of a reaction from someone. He kind of embraces the fact that, like, hey, I'm doing an adaptation of a manga. I'm already adopting that very indie manga drawing style, I'm gonna allow myself to borrow some other little visual elements of it too.
Well,
I mean,
Yuasa
screen
in
blocking
general,
is rare, in a lot of
Yuasa really
anime.
plays around with that kind of thing a lot in general. With that's kind of his style. Like there was like the thing in here where you had the I don't remember if it was the last episode or the second last episode where it had the audiences like tweets or like
Oh yeah, no,
IMs
it's
to
it's
each
it's
other.
it's the chat windows and the some of them are unrelated. It's like, hey, after this, do you want to get pasta? Like he just throws those in constantly, like
Well,
even with the
because it really
emojis. He
builds the
even
realism
uses
of
like
it.
the emojis.
Like a lot of people like bailing because it's kind of like, oh, I don't really care about this, and the kind of other people like, holy shit, like I never even heard of this guy before, like he's incredible. And it's like, wait, you're saying him? He got beat? No, he's like he won the Junior Olympics. He was beat by some nobody.
Oh, and then there was they had that couple in there where it's like, don't worry, you can win, because I believe in you or something like that. It's like they're like it's just like they only have like 4 lines each, but he does this almost meta narrative within there. Like they're the
Yeah.
protagonists of their own anime almost, and they of course get beaten right away. And she's like, "Oh right, I guess I shouldn't have." I mean, there's these great little moments in there that almost comment on the fact that this is a sports, anime.
Yeah. I
And
mean,
then he kind of undercuts them in really great ways that aren't, they aren't like throwaway gags, but they just fit really well.
one thing with Ping Pong is that while it looks, I'd say it looks one of the best looking anime that we've seen in years. I don't know if
Well,
it's like
there's some caveats, I think. I
yeah,
mean,
yeah. I'm saying like it looks extremely good in the sense that Yuasa's style is fantastic,
it's so
but
unique. Yeah.
he's very good at using his style, and his style in general is very good at covering up the fact that he doesn't necessarily have the most money or the largest
Or the
team supporting
fluid,
him or the
it's
best
not like,
schedule.
well, it's like
Like
the animation is not all that fluid in this. I mean, I
no,
can't speak for let's say the DVD version, which usually fixes these types of things. But I mean, his production schedule was, I think for this one especially, was very short notice and very tight. I mean, I remember when he was recruiting. I mean, he went to Twitter to recruit people for this show.
yeah, he was
You know,
basically calling in like like friends because one thing with Yuasa is that the fact that he's an auteur makes him kind of a like he's very much as my this is my impression. Keep in mind, I very much get the impression that he's kind of like loved by that sort of industry because in general you see that with these animation directors that they're a close knit group in Japan, and there's very much a love, especially for the auteurs there, the ones who kind of push only towards making that kind of
well, they're
stuff.
so rare. I mean, like that makes them even more like, oh my god, there's only so few. Like, please, I got,
Yeah, the fact that there's so many people who are so uncompromising about like we're making art.
yes.
I want to make art. And basically, he did his thing. He's like, hey, anybody who's got some free time that can come on down to the studio and help me out, I would super appreciate it.
Well, I mean, he was recruiting from abroad too. I mean, I had a classmate that was almost able to get on the schedule, but because the schedule was so tight, they weren't going to be able to get like the official documents to let him work on that show. I mean, he
Yeah.
was willing to pull from anywhere. So, I mean, and again, like for what he
Well,
was, for the considering all the difficulties, I mean, what came out was visually really interesting in a lot of ways. It's not the most fluid animation and there's a lot of use of stills, but it doesn't detract from what's going on. I
well,
mean,
he's
yes, there's
very good at using his
limitations.
he's very good at using his style to kind of cover up the fact that he's using stills and that it tends to be very interesting stills and he tends to have elements in them that kind of attract you away from the fact that like hey that's one thing with anime in general is that there's a lot of mouth waggle going on.
Yeah. Well, it's like
It
it's
work-
what we call limited animation, but
sure.
limited animation is not always a negative thing. It's only if you don't know how to use the limitations correctly.
And how you know how to kind of to diminish the effects, so to speak.
Yeah,
And that
exactly.
Yuasa's style is very good at working with kind of a minimal kind of movement.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I mean, look at some of his other works where he lets the characters just go all out, but that's not what necessarily what this called for.
I
Although
mean, he
I
still
think,
has those scenes.
oh
Certainly.
yeah, but again, they're not as maybe they don't have as many in betweens or frames, so it's not as fluid as I think his stuff normally is. Again, I think just schedule wise, but again, I as you said, like it's visually one of the best things out there. But of course, there's the caveats. I think it could have some more fluidity to it, but it that doesn't necessarily add or subtract something from this as an accomplishment. So it's complicated, like it's one of those what if things. And when you look at a work of art, it's like, oh, if only I had more time. It's like, well, you just didn't have the time to be able to do it.
But
What
no,
you
but
produced is
nobody
still
actually
great.
has all the time necessarily for every piece of work. That's the one
Oh
thing is
yeah.
that they're
I mean,
they're
this is not a Disney movie where they have people doing, one drawing for every frame and it's 24 drawings per second. Like, that's unreasonable.
yeah. I mean, and that's something unreasonable to expect from most works, even of things you praise to some degree. Like to expect everything to be or to look at it from a more general art sense. Like not everything is going to be the sense like I spent 20 years working on this one piece of art. Here it is. Like it's like it is what it is. It's perfection. You can't improve on this. Like sure, conceivably if he had more time he could work on this. He could make it look better in other degrees, but at the same time it looks freaking fantastic for what it is. Like it
Oh
is
yeah,
an
exactly.
amazing thing to watch. It is I would say very be a bit goofy with my languages. It is what you would say it'd be a feast for the eyes,
Yeah.
beyond everything else. Like it is. Yuasa's style is great to watch.
Well, especially because it's in contrast to just nothing else out there looks like it. And
No.
so few, I mean, I'd say not just in Japan, but anywhere else in the world is willing to have that kind of visual bravery to do something so different looking. Because a lot of people, when they come across it, they don't know how to process it. Like the human mind naturally likes to categorize things into very easily understandable stereotypes. And sometimes even, certain visuals, when we come across that, not just in terms of rhetoric, just visually, we go, I don't know how to process this.
Well,
And
I
I
mean, we
think
saw that to some.
he's willing to, and I think he's willing to go, you know what, I'm willing to kind of let some people get confused by it, but I'm going to try to do something that doesn't look like anything else.
I mean, we saw that to some degree with when the Adventure Time episode that he directed came out. That some people were like, "What the fuck is this?" They
Oh,
didn't.
yeah.
The people are just like, "This art style is fucking just weird. Like, is he
It
on
doesn't look like the
drugs?"
regular episodes. Yeah, like it's that
It's just
thing.
it's really just goofy kind of responses. Where a lot of people were like, "Wow." This was great. This was fantastic. I hope that really got a lot of people to check out his other works. But it's kind of like he very much has a unique style that works with this kind of thing. And
And again,
to be
I'm amazed that he was able to get that out of Flash. I mean, like we're so used to like when someone says like, "Oh, it's a Flash animation," we all instantly, or at
it's an
least most
insult.
people, well, no, it's just not an insult, but we certain things
I
come
mean,
to
it's an
mind
insult.
instantly. Like, well, I mean, it's usually used okay, yes, as a pejorative, but we kind of have like a category of like, okay, Flash. We kind of have like stereotypes in our mind of what looks like Flash cartoons.
Sure.
It doesn't look like he used Flash for it. I mean, and,
No.
and and there are studios out there that have used Flash in ways that it's like that doesn't look like that's done in Flash. I mean, I worked at one that they still do everything very traditionally, but it doesn't look like they used Flash. I think well, I actually had a lot of fun. Masaaki Yuasa is on Twitter. His English isn't very good, so if you could speak to him in Japanese, it's great. So he just posted this new video where he's recruiting for Science Saru, and he shows like a lot of the changes he's able to make in Flash with the animation and all the stuff. It's very impressive. If you can find it, it's on Vimeo. And I asked him about that. I was like, this is really kind of interesting that it's Flash that doesn't look like Flash. And he mentions a French studio called Ankama, which if you're familiar with like Wakfu and things like that, they use Flash. And he goes, these guys were kind of pioneers, and I'm kind of indebted to that, but I really want to push this medium forward. Even if we're working in Flash, we don't want to be kind of bound by those limitations. And I'm like, that's really awesome. I mean, it's not the software you use, it's how you use it. And I go like, I have nothing against the idea of someone using Flash. I mean, I find it buggy, but whatever. But he's able to use the software that so many others, allow that software to define the look of what they're making. He's like, I'm going to use the software, but I'm not going to let it define what my work looks like. And I'm like, that is so cool.
I mean, with one other thing with him is that he very much his art style and the works he tends to gravitate very much matches and fits with like kind of the ethos of the work that he's telling. Like the original artist of the manga that he adapted, of this manga, Ping Pong, Taiyo Matsumoto, has a very similar style that he meshes with very well. It's not the same as Yuasa's style, but
Oh
it's
yeah.
very much along those lines. And the the way that the art style is portrayed in Ping Pong very much aligns with the narrative. It's not like a discordant thing or like this doesn't really make sense with this story. It really actually emphasizes and improves, and really kind of
It's both abstract and yet naturalism at the same time, and I find that really just a
yeah,
great.
it's super interesting. Like he's like that with in general. Like you saw that. I mean, you see that kind of thing even with what was it, Kick Art to some degree, where it's got the
Mm.
very kind of grounded kind of realistic motions. It focuses very much on the fluid motion of the human body. And yet what's happening makes no sense whatsoever from a realistic standpoint.
Yeah.
It's like it's goofy and it's like silly.
Well, that's the thing about
BDSM wrestling,
animation.
but
Well, it's like that's why it's animation has this great leg up over live action in that with animated stuff you can get away with a certain level of silliness and surreality without people getting pulled out of the moment because when you're shown a drawing that's the only context of how that world works that you're
it's
given
already
and
disconnected from reality to some degree.
you buy into the reality that you're being shown a lot more readily than let's say when you watch a live action movie with special effects. I think there's a subconscious thing in the back of your mind that goes, okay, there's this, I don't see this in everyday life, therefore I kind of understand that this is special effects, versus in an animated thing like, let's say you made a live action version of Paprika, for example. It wouldn't be we wouldn't be able to buy into it, as a reality on the same level as if it was, as it's since it's drawn. The
Mm.
characters and the special effects and the oddity because they exist on the same visual universe. We kind of buy into that reality a lot more easily.
Because already the baseline for animation is
Already a
unreal.
surreality
Yeah,
to begin
I
with.
mean,
Yes, exactly.
so when in the middle of ping pong, when you have this ping pong battle, you have an airplane taking off in the middle of the thing, to depict
Visual metaphor.
for China basically, matching with them, or when you have dragon hitting the thing, and literally they basically show a dragon carrying the ping pong ball and just smashing into the basically the opponent. It doesn't come across as like, huh, they're doing something really weird there,
It
or
doesn't
like
come
I
off
don't know
as
what's
like a
going
Tim
on.
and Eric oddity thing.
Yeah, it comes across as like like, oh, I get what they're going for here. They're symbolic. You get the message very much in the core of it. There's no weird disconnect, and a lot of that, to be fair, also is how great Yuasa is at animation production and direction. Like,
Well, he knows how to. I mean, he's worked within the Japanese system, which is already chaotic and difficult with deadlines and budgets and all that type of stuff. And he's manned a lot of productions already, so he
well,
has that under his belt.
he's also very good at directing. I think his animators,
Oh yeah.
because the fact that he's able to have, because he's not hand animating all of this. Like
Oh
obviously
no no.
he gets in on a lot of this. Like you can tell that he is getting in on like a lot of scenes in here.
Well, he's hands on. Yeah.
Yeah, he's very hands on, in this sense. But like he's also very good at getting everyone else to kind of mesh up with his style, and getting the same sort of visual metaphors, and and help direct them and guide them to actually do it in the most effective way. He's very good at leading other things, and then that's why I'm really happy that he clearly goes out of his way also to pick up artists from other places and really work on cultivating them. Like
Yes.
he has that one. What's her name?
Yun Young Choi.
Yeah, basically, it was basically people kind of openly kind of the way discuss it over here as being his like protege, where it's a Korean animator that he's pretty much basically taken up as being, kind of someone who has not necessarily the similar style, but kind of a similar sort of approach to it.
Yeah.
And
Well, I
I'm
mean,
really
she
glad
she
that
did an
he's
episode of Space Dandy as well. I mean,
yeah,
they've both separately have done episodes, and a lot of people confuse the two of them because they have very similar sensibilities. There's a difference, of course, but they both have shared this kind of sensibility um, that kind of ties them together. And of course, them both coming together to form this new studio, Science Saru, is kind of just a really cool thing.
yeah. Um,
I mean,
so
I think that's a good amount. Ping Pong, definitely a recommendation. Go watch it on Hulu when you have a chance. It's just
yeah, if
it's.
you've not seen it, trust me, you really need to see it. Like it was, I would say, probably the best thing that came out animation wise last year. I would say.
I mean, there were a few good things out there, but it's the one that stands out the most to me as just
Yeah,
a special thing.
yeah, because
Yeah,
I would also say if you haven't seen it, definitely check out other works by Masaaki Yuasa.
yeah.
Uh, I think Tatami Galaxy is probably one of my top three favorite
it
anime of
was
all time.
it was very special. I would say also, I mean, I think if you want to see something that is a bit more adventurous visually, and doesn't have the kind of real life aspect, I think Kaiba has just visually just so interesting. I mean,
Kaiba is super visually interesting. Yeah, it
I
is.
mean, it doesn't look like anything else out there, and it has a great. It's a sci-fi story. It's still, it's very emotional at the same time, but it's still able to be so odd. I think
Kaiba
that's
is so the only thing with
it's
Kaiba
super
I'd say
sad.
is that
It's
it's
super
very
sad.
super weird at the beginning because it starts you completely in medias res and does not try to get you up to
Yeah,
up to snuff on what's
narratively,
going on to
it's
like
difficult.
halfway through.
Yeah, and I
But
think Tatami Galaxy ends up being funnier. I mean, there's like I think the Film Club is my favorite episode of that.
all
It's
the episodes are so
just
good.
they're so good. But I mean, but my favorite I think in terms of humor and just the shock of it was I think the Film Club episode.
Yeah, I mean Tatami Galaxy in general, I think everybody should check out because it is.
It's a bit more lighthearted, I think, than Kaiba. I mean, Kaiba is intense, so I think
Kaiba is intense, but even that has like very much Yuasa's signature sort of like, hey, look, cheer up.
yeah. I mean, there's a positivity at the end, but I mean,
Sure.
but there is some heavy moments.
Oh sure,
So
very heavy.
if you can find DVDs in general, buy DVDs of things when you want to support them. That's how a lot of these studios end up getting their money back. Especially since he has now started his own studio and future works, support him. I mean, Kickheart, as you said earlier, with that kind of fluidity, he was able to do that from a Kickstarter campaign where he wanted people to be able to pay for more in betweens, which kind of is how you get that fluidity. So, if you see stuff out, keep an eye out from him in the future, I think. So,
And if you're listening to this and you're like a executive for Funimation Entertainment, hey, can you like make DVDs slash Blu-rays for Tatami Galaxy? Because I would like to purchase Tatami Galaxy and own it in my home.
or
Right now, I can't
maybe
do that.
push it onto the try to push Adult Swim to pick up some of these shows. I mean, yes, they've been showing anime lately, but like it would be kind of cool if they start doing. I remember long back, they showed Paranoia Agent on TV. This would be kind of a really interesting departure for them to try. So that'd be kind of cool, and it's
Yeah.
quirky. It's quirky enough, I think, to fit their sensibility. So
Yeah. The thing I'd say with ping pong is also that it's about ping pong, just to reiterate what I was at the beginning. But even if you have no interest in ping pong or even sports in general, like I'm not a very I really don't care much about sports at all personally. But it's
wow,
something that's very
really?
much worth seeing because the actual messages within it and what it actually does to analyze, the ethos behind enjoying sports is super fascinating. And the actual presentation, the actual story within it is also super great.
Well, I think it applies to. I mean, even if you're just an artist, understanding work, being in an art world versus just producing art. I think it's the same thing as in being in the ping pong world versus playing ping pong.
Well, it's kind
It
of
applies to so many different people
it
and
applies to
fields,
anything that
and
you can have a
it's
passion for
universal.
and
Yeah.
enjoy that also can be something that you compete or have to or becomes a livelihood.
Yes. So that is ping pong. So be prepared for our next episode, which we are. Oh boy.
Sigh.
Okay, so we, of course, we have to balance out something, great with something. I don't think anyone will be surprised that we're not fans of this. But we're going to be talking about Johnny Test.
Uh,
Or as I like to call it or subtitle it, the dark side of Canadian subsidies. There are other Canadian subsidy shows, but I think I kind of want to do Johnny Test first before we kind of get into the deeper cuts because Johnny Test is broadcast outside of Canada. So we're lucky that we don't get some of the other shows, but I kind of want to. It's yeah. So we'll be talking about Johnny Test.
how is there 130 fucking episodes of that thing? How has it ran like fucking like 8 years?
The dark side of Canadian subsidies.
Uh,
uh, it'll be interesting. May or may not try to stream a couple episodes just to show people what we're talking about if they don't, if they've
I'm
never
sure people
watched.
could watch it if they
Well,
want to, but
yeah.
why would you want to, really?
Well, unless you had to, or unless you're just had. Most people, I think, have watched it just by osmosis through Cartoon Network, and they just have the TV on. But yeah, that's going to be next episode, Johnny Test. So look forward to that.
Yeah.
So signing out, I am R. Magnuson, also known as Neeksy. You can find me on Twitter at at RY Magnuson, 2 S's, ON. Feel free
Yeah.
to contact either of us if you guys have questions, comments, or suggestions for maybe a cartoon that we have missed. I've gotten some people to send me some nice, kind of more obscure things. Like someone sent me the original short for Family Dog before that was turned into a TV series. So I might try to see if we can go back into the early '90s when everyone was making these shows and try to drag up episodes and things like that. It's easier if you have something obscure, if you can send me a link or something to where I can view it, because I don't have access to I don't have an archive. And
Yep.
you can find Zorak at.
SA Zorak on Twitter. Um, yeah.
All right. So see you guys next time.